If you've ever stood in a room full of family, flesh, and blood, people who know your baby teeth stories, your scrape knee summers, your every damn scar, and still felt like you were being erased in real time, then maybe you'll understand what I did next. Maybe you'll stop judging long enough to listen. Because when I found out they were planning to sell everything my grandfather bled into existence just so they could cash in and pretend they were finally free, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten. I did something far worse. I outplayed them. It started the way most betrayals do, quietly, in a soft room filled with soft voices pretending they weren't burying a legacy. We were in the conference room that still smelled faintly of varnished oak and black coffee. The same room where my grandfather signed the charter of Wilson Manufacturing in 1963 with the same calloused hands that built his first prototype in a rusted barn in the dead of winter. I sat across from my father, who couldn't meet my eyes, and next to my sister, whose French manicured fingers were already idling across her phone screen as if she had better things to do than destroy our past. Let's not be dramatic, May, my sister Lauren said, without looking up. It's not like we're burning the place down. It's a sale. People sell companies all the time. I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence fill the space between us like gasoline. And you're fine with a condo complex where our factory floor used to be? I asked, my voice steady, surgical. You're fine with luxury lofts named after the men who laid down steel here with their bare hands? Lauren rolled her eyes. You're so poetic, sis. But nostalgia doesn't pay for Dad's retirement. Or your half-baked ideas. Our father, seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat like it was the only defense he had left. May, honey, he said, in the voice that always followed disappointment. It's just time. We've had a good run. 70 years. The building needs work. The demand isn't what it used to be. The offer's more than fair. Fair. That word. That filthy, bloodless word. I leaned forward, palms flat against the table, careful to keep the rage in my bones from leaking into my voice. They'll gut it. Dad. You understand that, right? They'll knock down the brick wall with the signatures from the original line team. They'll bulldoze the bay where you learned to weld. They'll turn it into a fucking juice bar. He looked away. And I knew. Right then, I knew. They'd already made their choice. But I wasn't done. Not even close, because what they didn't know, what no one in that cold, polished room realized, was that while they were counting zeros and dreaming of beaches and breezy escapes, I had been rebuilding the company behind their backs. Quietly. Strategically. Viciously. I'd spent the last 6 months doing what my family stopped doing years ago, fighting for the future instead of fleeing from the past. And now, I was about to change everything. I didn't know a man could gut you with a smile until I watched my father hand my birthright to someone else while pretending it was an act of love. We were back in that boardroom, the same one I had walked out of 2 weeks prior thinking I had changed the course of history, the one where I had slammed down the final page of the legacy client contract and said, in a voice that dared anyone to question me, it's done. We're safe. And for a moment, just a flicker, I believed I had won. I thought I had secured more than a deal. I thought I had secured my place. But the smile my father wore as he stood at the head of the conference table now wasn't pride. It was relief. The kind of brittle relief that comes not from seeing someone rise, but from removing the burden of choice. I'm retiring, he said, lifting his coffee mug with the same ease as if he were announcing he'd just paid off a credit card. No drumroll. No ceremony. Just that. The silence that followed cracked like ice under tension. No one moved. Not even Lauren, who usually couldn't be quiet long enough to hear her own shadow. I've made arrangements, he continued, and now his voice carried the kind of rehearsed gravitas you only hear at funerals and investor dinners. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down from daily operations and appointing Lauren as the new interim CEO. I think I forgot how to breathe for a moment. Not because I didn't expect the betrayal, but because I hadn't expected it to come with such a practiced smile. Lauren's head tilted, just slightly, as if she were hearing this for the first time, though I could see the glint of satisfaction already igniting behind her glossed lips and pre-prepared nod. This isn't, I started, but the words snagged in my throat like rusted metal. "We need a unifying presence," my father said, and he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring somewhere just beyond my left shoulder, like I'd already become part of the wallpaper. Someone who understands people. Someone who can build bridges. I almost laughed. Truly, I almost did. Build bridges? I built lifeboats while they were rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. I built scaffolding out of threats and silence and desperation. I didn't build bridges, I built strongholds. And apparently, that was the problem. "You've done incredible work, May," he added, and now his eyes landed on mine like the last nail in a coffin, "but you've been under enormous stress. You pushed too hard. You carried too much. It's time to let go for a little while and recharge." Recharge. As if I were a phone battery in need of an outlet, not the engine that had been keeping this company alive long enough for him to make this announcement without being laughed out of the room. "I see," I said, and the words came out clean, smooth, soft even, though inside my ribs I could feel a scream building with teeth and fire. Lauren cleared her throat delicately, the way she always did before a speech that was really just a monologue wrapped in sugar. "I just want to say how honored I am," she began, already stepping into the center of the room like it had been built just for her spotlight. "May's done amazing work, and I hope to continue her efforts, with a greater focus on collaboration, of course. We want everyone to feel heard." That last word, heard, landed like a slap wrapped in a ribbon. Because I had never been heard. I had just been useful. The rest of the room, the department heads, the shareholders, the legal team began to nod like metronomes, synchronized not by conviction, but by survival. They wanted a leader who smiled, not one who bled. The HR rep slid a folder in front of me with the kind of stiff-handed professionalism that made it clear she didn't want eye contact. Inside it was my performance bonus, neatly typed and pre-approved, as if my father had always known he would need to soften this particular blow with money. I looked at the figure and made no expression. It was generous, maybe even obscene by corporate standards. Enough for me to smile and say thank you and disappear quietly. I picked up the folder, closed it gently, and offered my own version of a smile, tight-lipped, sharp-eyed, venom-dipped. "I appreciate it," I said, standing slowly. "Congratulations, Lauren. I'm sure you'll be fantastic." And with that, I walked out of the boardroom, out of the applause, out of the manufactured celebration, and into the elevator where the silence finally wrapped around me like a funeral veil. As the elevator descended, I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not punch the polished mirror across from me, though I imagined the satisfaction of it vividly. Instead, I did what I have always done. I planned. Because if they thought I would take this quietly, they'd clearly never paid attention to what I was building while they were sleeping. They thought they handed the keys to the kingdom to the better daughter. But what they didn't know, what they could never know, was that I had already changed the locks. I didn't return to my office. Not because I wasn't welcome anymore, but because I didn't need to. Everything that mattered to me, every document, every file, every thread of leverage, I'd already mirrored, backed up, and secured in a place neither Lauren nor our father knew existed. It was stored on a private drive, encrypted with a cipher based on a phrase my grandfather used to whisper to me when I was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. "Iron bends before it breaks, but my girl, she forges." I slid into the back seat of a cab without saying a word and gave the driver the address of my apartment, the one no one in the company knew about. I'd bought it 2 years ago under a trust name, a place with no strings, no plaques, no family memories. Just clean lines and locked doors. Once inside, I kicked off my heels, poured a glass of wine I didn't really want, and pulled out the binder I kept in a fireproof lockbox under my floorboards. It was labeled contingencies. Not plans. Not ideas. Contingencies. Because I knew this day might come. I just didn't know how sharp it would feel to watch it arrive. Inside that binder were names, clients, suppliers, regulatory contacts, many of whom owed me favors not because I was kind, but because I had gotten them out of impossible binds without blinking. They weren't loyal to Wilson Manufacturing. They were loyal to me, and I would call in every one of those deaths. I flipped to the second tab labeled Legal Leverage and smiled for the first time in hours. Because here's the thing they forgot in their rush to crown a queen: they forgot about the war chest sitting in the basement. While Lauren had been busy throwing curated brunches and perfecting her head tilt for PR photo ops, I had been reviewing property easement maps and environmental impact assessments. I had found the loopholes that allowed us to resist redevelopment. I had gotten the heritage classification for the west wing of the factory quietly filed under a preservation clause from the 1980s, one that required any structural changes to be approved by a 3-person committee, of which I happened to be one. Lauren might now hold the title, but I still held the terrain. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than I had in weeks, and I wore a shade of lipstick so bold it bordered on weaponized. People stared. I smiled when Lauren walked in with her new executive assistant in tow and a fresh bouquet of congratulatory lilies clutched to her chest. She looked surprised to see me sitting behind the executive conference table. "Oh," she said, blinking rapidly. "Didn't expect to see you here." I took a sip from my coffee and said, with perfect calm, "Just wrapping up a few final projects. Legacy work." She smiled. The fake kind. The one that didn't reach her eyes, but stretched the corners of her mouth with professional tightness. "Of course. Take all the time you need," she said, then hesitated. "We're doing a soft rollout of the leadership transition on socials today. Just wanted to make sure you're okay with how we phrase everything." I nodded. "Absolutely. Just make sure you spell my name right when you write about all the deals I closed," before stepping aside. She blinked again, but didn't reply. As she turned away, I saw her back stiffen just a fraction. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, I sent 3 emails. Point 1 to our city's historical registry office, reminding them that any intended renovations to a property under active heritage review required 6 weeks' notice. Point 1 to our largest contract supplier, letting them know that my involvement would be transitioning, but I'd still be managing my consulting firm independently. And 1 to a reporter I trusted, a woman who'd once told me in a private interview that she didn't believe in coincidences, only in cover-ups. Subject line: Family Dynasty. Silent War. Care to talk? I ended that day not as a corporate ghost, but as the ghostwriter of my family's future obituary. They gave her the crown. I kept the throne. It arrived in a manila envelope, anonymous, unrequested, and dropped on my doorstep like a package meant to explode, not with sound, but with silence. There was no name, no return address, no seal beyond the crude strip of duct tape pressed hastily along the opening. If I'd been anyone else, I might have laughed and tossed it aside, assuming it was some corporate vendor desperate for a meeting or an amateur whistleblower with half-baked conspiracy theories and too much time, but I wasn't anyone else. I was Mae Wilson. And by now, I knew better than to dismiss anything that arrived without explanation. I brought the envelope inside without ceremony, laid it across the marble counter of my kitchen, and poured myself a second cup of coffee even though I hadn't finished the first. Caffeine wasn't the reason. Ritual was. You don't open an unmarked message from the abyss without grounding yourself in something solid, something hot, bitter, and utterly real. The papers inside weren't old. In fact, many of them were time-stamped within the last 9 months, right around the time I had started clawing this company back from its slow rot. There were transcripts of emails, printed out in clean courier font, with confidential watermarks so faint they almost felt like afterthoughts. Names were redacted in black ink, but the tone, the phrasing, the vanity, that was unmistakable. Lauren, she hadn't just known about the developers, she had been talking to them before the crisis even began, and not just talking, plotting, orchestrating, leveraging whispers into proposals and proposals into memorandums. Page after page, it became increasingly obvious that while I had been negotiating with our oldest legacy client to save the company's soul, she had been dancing behind closed doors with people whose only goal was demolition, not transition. Not innovation, demolition. She wanted it all razed. There, on page 17, was a bullet point summary titled, Phase 1, Public Relations Language. And below that, in bold italics, a quote that sent something acidic twisting in my stomach. Use words like renewal, revival, opportunity. Avoid terms like teardown. Family optics matter. That wasn't strategy. That was premeditated annihilation dressed in Sunday best. The final pages detailed what she intended to do with her payout. She'd already formed the LLC. LMC Group stood for Lauren Marie Creative, a sickly sweet name for a venture described as a lifestyle and wellness brand targeting millennial executives seeking balance through curated design, mindfulness coaching, and brand partnerships. Wellness. Mindfulness. Curated branding. She wanted to kill the company our grandfather built with grit, grease, and sleepless ambition for yoga mats, candles, and fucking throw pillows. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Instead, I placed every page back in order, slid the stack into a new folder labeled Insurance, and moved to my laptop with the kind of cold clarity that only comes when you've passed the threshold of betrayal so deep there's no way back to innocence. Because now it wasn't about the company. Now it was about power. I opened my banking app, double-checked the performance bonus they had given me, the money meant to keep me quiet, docile, and grateful, and wired it immediately into the holding account I had set up the week after Lauren's appointment. From there, I moved quickly. The real estate company working with Lauren's pet developers was a small but aggressive upstart called Atlas Forge, a name designed to sound gritty and aspirational. Like it was forged in the fires of industry instead of born in a WeWork pitch deck funded by venture capital. Atlas Forge had made a name for itself in precisely the kind of ethically gray zones where developers push boundaries, skirt historical preservation laws, and repackage destruction as growth. They were expanding rapidly, especially into legacy industrial properties, factories, shipyards, and old manufacturing corridors that could be converted into glossy high-rise condos with rooftop herb gardens and zero parking. I didn't need to wonder why they were interested in our site. We were prime territory. We were a gold mine, and Lauren, for all her polished incompetence, had probably promised them a smooth transaction. What she hadn't promised them, what she hadn't considered, was me. I purchased stock quietly, in fractional shares across multiple brokerage accounts under different LLCs. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would raise alarms. Just enough to secure a whisper of presence on the investor reports. Then I bought more. Not because I thought I could control the company, but because I didn't need to control it. I only needed enough leverage to insert myself into conversations that Lauren didn't know I could hear. I joined forums, silent and watchful. I hired a friend, an ex-corporate intelligence analyst who now freelanced as a market researcher, to flag any changes in Atlas Forge's internal movement. Within weeks, I had access to quarterly planning documents, board agendas, even raw transcripts from pitch meetings. Lauren's name appeared twice. Once as a high-trust strategic partner. The second time as project spearhead pending acquisition. They thought she could deliver us on a silver platter, but they didn't know that silver melts under flame, and I had already lit the match by the time our quarterly leadership summit rolled around. I was no longer just the girl they thought they could silence with a bonus and some hollow praise. I was an emerging shareholder in the very empire that was supposed to rise from my family's grave, and they didn't even see it coming. I arrived late on purpose. Not disrespectfully late. Not scandalously late. Just enough to make them wait. Just enough to remind them I still existed outside their lines of control. The room was decked out in muted tones, faux wood finishes, and motivational quotes framed in brushed steel. Lauren had already taken the center of the stage, wearing a cream blouse that screamed wholesome authority and enough foundation to cover a multitude of strategic sins. She welcomed everyone with a grin that curled too far upward, then launched into a speech about fresh visions, respecting our heritage while embracing the future, and leaning into opportunities that align with our values. I took a seat near the back, crossed my legs slowly, and met her gaze when it landed on me mid-sentence. She faltered for exactly one breath, then recovered, then smiled too hard. I didn't smile back. Afterward, there were handshakes and wine. Plates of cheese. Quiet music. The sound of a company pretending it wasn't rotting from within. One of our junior VPs, Ryan, a sweet guy with bad posture and a trust fund he never talked about, found me lingering near the window. "Heard you're working on something big," he said. His voice low, like we were co-conspirators in some political thriller instead of two exhausted executives watching a dynasty collapse in slow motion. "Just tidying up loose ends," I replied. His eyes darted toward Lauren, who was now deep in conversation with a group of potential partners I recognized from Atlas Forge's early development circle. "They seem really excited about her," he said carefully. I took a sip of wine and tilted my head. "Of course they are," I said, my voice sharp enough to slice through the ambient noise. "They always are, until the paperwork hits." That night, I didn't go home. I went to a different office, one I'd rented off book, 2 floors below one of our old distribution centers that had quietly been decommissioned months ago. No one knew about it except me, my lawyer, and the private security firm I had on retainer for precisely this kind of long war. I opened my laptop and began building what I called the redemption file. It contained everything: evidence of Lauren's secret communications, financial inconsistencies in her early filings, projections she had inflated to make the sale appear more urgent than it actually was, and most importantly, draft contracts between her and Atlas Forge that predated her official leadership appointment, contracts signed under an alias, but traceable through one tiny mistake. She had used her real birthday in the security verification questions. All it would take was a single leak. 1. Strategically timed reveal, but I didn't want revenge just yet. No, I wanted leverage. I wanted control, and I was going to use her ambition to get IT to be why the time I decided to start my own company. The decision didn't. There's a moment that comes after betrayal, after silence, after every false smile and every patronizing pat on the back, when clarity isn't loud or painful, it's surgical. You stop dreaming of revenge. You start building infrastructure. You stop playing their game. You start replacing the board. IT began, as most revolutions do, with a single conversation behind a locked door. I met Jameson Price in the parking garage beneath a downtown bar no one respectable admits to knowing. He'd been the director of logistics under our father for 15 years before Lauren fired him quietly. Too expensive, too old school, too loyal to the wrong bloodline. He stepped out of his car and looked at me like a man who wasn't sure if he was about to get mugged or drafted into something holy. "You said this was urgent," he murmured, hands in his coat pockets, voice low enough to avoid echo. "It is," I said, and handed him a folder thick with the kind of information that doesn't get emailed. Inside were blueprints, operational structure, client lists, project proposals, NDAs, and the one thing no spreadsheet can quantify: trust forged in fire. "I'm not just building a competitor," I told him, leaning against the concrete pillar like it was a throne. "I'm building a successor. Something that remembers where it came from but refuses to die there." He didn't speak for almost a minute. Just flipped through the folder like it was scripture, and then he looked up and nodded once, like a soldier who knows exactly which war he wants to die in. That was the first signature I got, the first name on the new ledger. The company I formed was called Forgebound, a nod to the weight of legacy, but stripped of the rust that had corroded everything in the Wilson name. No family titles. No false nostalgia. No portraits of dead men on the walls. Just results. Within 2 weeks, I had rented office space in a newly renovated warehouse on the edge of the city, far enough from Wilson HQ that no one would ask questions, but close enough that every time they looked out their window, they'd see the future being built just beyond their reach. I didn't poach employees. I rescued them. When I reached out to Vanessa, our former contracts manager who had once quadrupled our client retention rate before being buried under Lauren's so-called streamlined marketing team, she wept when she saw the offer letter. Not because the money was better, but because someone finally remembered who the hell she was to be. By the end of the month, I had 10 of the top 20 employees Lauren relied on, and none of them even asked what my long-term plan was. They didn't need to. They knew me. I don't lead with slogans. I lead with results. Forgebound didn't waste time branding or launching a flashy PR campaign. I let the silence do the talking. I let our work speak in invoices and deliverables and quiet emails that confirmed contracts previously assumed to be Wilson property were now migrating, client by client, project by project. Every deal Lauren had once used to validate her vision began slipping quietly through her fingers like sand through a cracked hourglass, and as her empire frayed, mine solidified, because while she was still selling dreams to developers with buzzwords and backroom deals, I was doing something far more dangerous stuff. I was buying the land under their feet. I started with the smallest rival developer, Coventry Built Group, an aging but stable firm with 3 mid-level industrial clients and a reputation for slow but dependable work. They were bleeding from leadership turnover and suffocating under a mountain of deferred projects, but their balance sheets still showed one thing that mattered: they owned land. Not paper projections, not speculative airspace, but tangible, zoning-approved, infrastructure-laid property in 3 expansion zones Lauren's developers were salivating over. Through a shell corporation, Elandra Capital, I quietly acquired a 49% stake. Then I called in favors. Then I sent flowers. Then I attended board meetings not as the angry daughter of a crumbling legacy, but as an investor with impeccable timing and an even better smile. Within 3 months, I controlled 62% of Coventry's decision-making through proxy. And no one, not Lauren, not Atlas Forge, not the City Planning Commission, had any idea that the woman blocking their permits, undercutting their bids, and redirecting their workforce was the same woman they thought they'd discarded with a smile and a performance bonus. Every time Lauren's team lost a contract, they blamed supply chain delays. Every time a developer backed out of a meeting, they said it was just budget reallocation. Every time someone asked where the talent was going, they pointed to Fordbound and whispered that it was just a fluke, just a coincidence. But I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in architecture. By the end of the quarter, Wilson Manufacturing was bleeding. Half their mid-range projects had either stalled or vanished. Their senior project manager had resigned mid-sprint and joined Forgebound within 3 hours, and Lauren, she was still smiling on social media, still posting inspirational quotes with photos of lattes and recycled mahogany desks, still pretending she was piloting a rocket ship instead of steering a shipwreck. The family name took the hit, public perception turned. The whispers began first in private meetings, then at industry panels, then in trade blogs that used phrases like leadership instability and questionable strategic choices. That's when I send in my intermediaries, 0.3 of them, all independent, all clean. Each one approached Wilson Manufacturing with quiet interest in acquiring the company's remaining contracts, licensing the intellectual property, and possibly folding their operations into a streamlined model built on next-generation manufacturing principles. Each one was, of course, backed by me, but Lauren didn't know that, not yet, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about resurrection. This was about legacy by another name. They thought they could replace me with someone softer, someone who smiled more, someone who didn't remind them of how much it hurt to be held accountable. But softness doesn't build empires, steel does, and I am my grandfather's blood. I do not beg, I do not retreat, I do not forgive, I build. The day I announced the acquisition, the sky outside was gray with the kind of heavy, waiting stillness that always precedes a storm. Thick clouds hanging low like a prophecy no one wants to read aloud. We held the press conference in what used to be the main assembly hall at Wilson Manufacturing, now gutted, restructured, and reborn as the innovation hub for Forgebound Industries. The walls had been scrubbed of grime, the floors sanded to a raw gleam, but I Hadelftone thing untouched, the steel plate bolted to the foundation in the northwest corner that still bore my grandfather's initials. Etched by hand when he poured the concrete in 1965, I stood exactly 3 feet from that plate as I stepped behind the podium, not because I needed symbolism, but because I needed something sacred beneath my feet. Cameras clicked, phones glowed. Industry leaders, former competitors, press, agents, city officials, and half a dozen faces that used to smile politely while stabbing me in the back filled the room with that polite hush reserved for public power transfers. My name, I began, My voice not loud but unmistakably firm, is May Wilson. And as of this morning, I am the sole majority shareholder of the Wilson Manufacturing Corporation. No reaction at first, just stillness, and then gasps, rapid typing, murmurs. A couple of the older board members looked physically ill, but I kept going because the truth didn't require their approval anymore. For years, I said, steady as stone. This company survived not because of its shareholders or slogans or sanitized leadership, but because of grit, resilience, and the people who refused to let it die quietly. A pause. Not for drama, but for breath. I'm here to tell you that Wilson Manufacturing, as it has existed, no longer does. It is now a division of Forge-bound Industries. It will operate under a new leadership structure, a revised mission, and a redefined culture that rewards action over performance, courage over consensus, and results over rituals. There it was, the transfer of power, not sealed in legal documents or executive handshakes, but spoken aloud in front of cameras that would broadcast the truth to everyone who had ever doubted me. I didn't name my father. I didn't name Lauren. Because this moment wasn't about them, it was about what came next. I saw him in the crowd. My father. He wasn't seated at the front, where the board had clustered like old relics, mourning their museum. He stood near the back, arms folded, expression unreadable, not leaning on anyone, not smiling, not scowling. He didn't approach me after the announcement. He didn't need to. He just nodded once, and that was enough. As for Lauren. She had watched it all unfold not from the crowd, but from the far side of the press floor, surrounded by executives who used to call her visionary, but now pretended they didn't remember her extension number. Her face was frozen. Not angry, not ashamed, just empty, like someone whose map no longer matched the terrain. I found her later in what used to be her office, the walls stripped bare. Her desk already cleared except for a single framed photo of us from a Christmas gala 5 years ago, back when we still pretended to be sisters who liked each other. She didn't look up when I entered. I expected gloating, she said, her voice low and tired. You expected wrong, I said simply. She finally met my eyes. There was no venom in hers, just the heavy weight of someone who had mistaken momentum for destiny. I don't hate you, I told her, and I meant it. But I won't forget what you tried to do. She nodded once, as if that was all she could offer. There's a role, I continued. Middle operations. Project compliance. It's not glamorous, but it matters. Her mouth twitched, but she didn't argue. It's mercy, I added, not an apology. She nodded again, slower this time. I'll take it, she whispered. I turned to leave, then paused. One condition, I said without looking back. You never speak for the company again. Not to the press. Not to clients. Not to the interns who refill the damn coffee machines. She didn't reply, but she didn't object, and that was the end of the war. Rebuilding wasn't ceremonial. IT wasn't cathartic. IT was methodical. IT was brutal. IT was every bit the grinding machinery of vision turned into reality. Stripped of romance and softened only by the quiet pride of watching something rise from the wreckage you refused to let bury you. I kept the name Forgebound, because names matter, because if I had renamed the company Wilson again, people would have mistaken it for sentimentality, and I didn't build this out of love. I built it out of bone. We rewrote everything: contract structures, talent acquisition systems, bonus structures, sustainability benchmarks, community investment protocols, manufacturing pipelines. I made decisions with data, with instinct, and with the sharpened edge of memory reminding me that no legacy is sacred unless it earns that title every damn day. We kept the old factory, restored it, retrofitted it, and rebranded it not as a monument, but as a proving ground. Every new engineer starts there. Every major product prototype begins on that floor. Every intern must spend one full day each quarter walking the halls, touching the steel, reading the names of the people who once made things with their hands before technology made it easy. I didn't want worship. I wanted continuity. I wanted a company that didn't just survive me, but one that would never again depend on blind trust in the people at the top. And in the quiet moments, when the lights dimmed and the conference rooms emptied and the world stopped demanding decisions, I would sit in my office, the one on the top floor overlooking the factory, and open the bottom drawer of my desk. There, wrapped in a weathered envelope no larger than my hand, was the photo I had kept hidden for years. My grandfather, standing beside the original press line, sleeves rolled, hands black with oil, eyes gleaming with the fire of a man who believed in work more than talk, and legacy more than pride. He wasn't smiling, he never did in photos. But his stance said everything I needed to remember. You build what they tell you is impossible. You take the weight they can't carry, and when they shut the door on you, you don't knock. You break the damn lock, take the room, and build a better house. I closed the drawer slowly. And when I stood, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like something older, something stronger, something forged. And finally, I understood. They gave me nothing. And still, I became everything.